In this episode of Mind the Gap, Michael Comyn takes a wry look at a familiar social character, the person who dominates the conversation without ever quite noticing it. Drawing on a line from Dancing Queen, "I'm nothing special. In fact, I'm a bit of a bore." Michael explores what really sits beneath that idea, not just the humor of it, but the subtle impact it has on how we connect, or fail to. With a mix of observation, insight, and a touch of gentle self-reflection, he asks a question that lands closer to home than we might expect. When does talking stop being sharing and start becoming something else? This is Mind the Gap. And here's Michael.
There's a line from Dancing Queen that always makes me smile. "I'm nothing special. In fact, I'm a bit of a bore." Well, that's ABBA doing what they do best. Light touch and a wink in the lyric. But take that line out of the music for a moment and let it stand on its own, and it lands differently. I'm a bit of a bore. It's not something many of us would say, not seriously, not about ourselves. And yet, if we're honest, we've all thought it. Not about ourselves, perhaps, about someone else, quietly, internally, usually while nodding to ourselves. I saw something recently that caught this perfectly. One well-known talker in a group, the kind of person who holds the floor without drawing breath, made a sudden exit. Not gradually, not easing out, they simply left. Because another equally well-known talker had just arrived. No discussion, no acknowledgement, just a moment of recognition. There isn't room for both of us here. And off they went. It was, I have to admit, very funny, but also revealing. Because what you're seeing in that moment isn't just personality. It's a breakdown in conversation itself. At its best, conversation is a shared act. There's a rhythm to it. You speak. I listen. I respond. You adjust. And underneath that, there's awareness. You notice when someone wants to come in. You sense you've gone on a little bit too long, and you step back. Sorry, I've been talking too much. We've all said it. And when we do, something resets and the space opens again. A bore doesn't reach that moment. Now, it would be easy to think a bore is simply someone who talks too much. But that's not quite it. We all talk too much sometimes, when we're excited, nervous, trying to explain something that matters to us. That's just human. A bore is something else. A bore is someone who doesn't notice you. They don't track the signals, the slight pause when someone else might speak, the shift in posture, the intake of breath, the small, almost invisible cues that say, "I've something to add." Those signals go missing. And the effect of that is subtle, but real. You begin to disappear from the conversation. Not physically, you're still there, still nodding, but your presence becomes thinner. You're no longer part of something shared, you're an audience. Now here's where it gets interesting. Perhaps the easy interpretation is arrogance. This person thinks their stories matter more. And sometimes it's true, but I'm not convinced it's the full picture. More often, I think, it's anxiety. A long-standing pattern where silence feels genuinely uncomfortable, so it gets filled. Quickly, consistently. What we experience from the outside as self-absorption may in fact be self-protection, a way of staying in control of the moment. But there's something more specific underneath that, if you look closely enough. Because the fear isn't really of silence itself. Silence is just the surface. What lives underneath? It's the fear of being found uninteresting. And here's the irony that makes this worth pausing on. The bore, the person we've experienced as relentlessly, exhaustingly present in conversation, is often driven by a terror of being invisible, of speaking and finding no one particularly engaged, of the moment where the room moves on and you realize you weren't quite as compelling as you needed to be. So they don't leave room for that moment. They fill it in advance. They keep going, not because they're indifferent to your interest, but because they're acutely, almost painfully aware of it. Every pause is a potential verdict. every silence, a gap where the evidence might come in. The talking, in other words, is not confidence, it's the performance of confidence. And like most performances of that kind, it achieves almost exactly the opposite of what was intended. Because the more the space gets filled, the less anyone can actually respond. And the less anyone responds, the more anxious the talker becomes. And the more anxious the talker becomes, you got the idea, the more they talk. Which raises a question I find genuinely curious. What bores a bore? Because they do get bored, everyone does. The question is what it takes. And I think the answer, if you watch carefully, is this. A bore is bored by another bore. Not immediately. There's usually a brief period of mutual recognition, even warmth. Two people who like to talk, finding each other, a kind of relief almost. But it doesn't hold. Because what a bore actually needs from conversation, though they couldn't tell you this, is an audience, not a participant. Not someone who pushes back or redirects or takes the thread somewhere unexpected. An audience, attentive, receptive, willing to follow. Put two bores together and neither of them gets that. They're both transmitting. Nobody's receiving. And so each one, in their own way, starts to feel the thing they most dread. Unheard. The conversation becomes full of effort, then mildly irritating, and one of them finds a reason to leave. But here's what I think is really happening in that moment. A bore defaults to boring because they never properly learned, or perhaps never been required to learn, that the other person in the conversation is as real as they are. Not as a social nicety, not as a principle, but as a felt, present reality. Someone who came into the room with something. Someone who's also hoping, in their quiet way, to be heard. Now that's not a moral failing. It's more like a gap in development. An understanding that simply didn't get built. Possibly because it was never modelled. Possibly because it was never necessary. And possibly because talking fast and confidently was rewarded early on and the feedback never came. The bore, at some level, is still waiting for that feedback. Still in a room where talking is the only currency. Still not quite aware that the room has changed. It's almost like two radio signals trying to occupy the same frequency. The sound distorts, and one of them drops out. So here's the uncomfortable part, because it would be very easy to leave this here, to recognize the behavior in others, to smile at it, even laugh at it and move on. But there's a more useful question sitting just underneath all of this. Where do we do it? Not the extreme version, not the obvious version, the quieter version. Do we ever tell the same story again because it positions us well? Do we listen just enough to respond rather than enough to understand? Do we miss the moment when someone else is trying to come in? If we're honest, there are flashes of it. Small ones perhaps, but they're there. And this, it seems to me, is worth holding on to. Not for reasons to stop talking, conversation without energy is its own problem, but as a reason to stay curious about the space between people. Because when conversation is working, really working, you feel it. The back and forth, the ease, the sense that something is being built together, a kind of shared spark that moves between people, not from one person outward. And to get there, something has to happen before the speaking begins. There's another line from the same song. But I suddenly lose control, and there's a fire within my soul. Good conversation has that. Energy, momentum, something alive in the exchange. But the fire only takes hold when there's room for it. So maybe the question is, am I a bore? That's too blunt, too final. Maybe the better question is, quieter than that. Am I leaving room for the fire? Mind the Gap.
You've been listening to Mind the Gap with Michael Comyn. In a world where everyone has something to say, perhaps the real skill is knowing when to pause, when to notice, and when to leave just enough space for someone else to come in. If this episode made you think, or even smile. You'll find more reflections like this across the series, along with Michael's books available now on Amazon. Wherever you're listening from, thank you for being part of a growing global audience. Follow or subscribe to Mind the Gap and share this episode with someone who values a good conversation. Until next time, please mind the gap.